My landlord secretly rented out my apartment to tourists while I was in the hospital. The key wouldn't turn. I stared at the brass lock on apartment 4B, my hands trembling from 3 weeks of hospital recovery after the motorcycle accident. This was definitely my door. Same scratched number I'd passed every day for 2 years. I tried the key again, twisting harder. Nothing. A woman's voice drifted through the door, speaking what sounded like German, then laughter. Multiple people were inside my apartment talking casually like they belonged there. My stomach dropped as I pressed my ear against the wood. These weren't voices I recognized. I knocked hesitantly, my heart hammering against my ribs. The conversation stopped abruptly. Footsteps approached, and the door swung open to reveal a middle-aged woman in a hotel bathrobe, holding a steaming coffee mug. She looked at me like I was some deranged stranger disturbing her morning routine. Behind her, I could see my living room, but everything felt wrong. Suitcases sat by my couch. Travel brochures were scattered across my coffee table. A man in tourist clothes occupied the spot where I used to binge Netflix every evening. The woman said something in German to her companion, who stood and joined her at the doorway. They both stared at me expectantly, waiting for me to explain why I was bothering them. Words stuck in my throat as my brain struggled to process the impossible scene. This was my apartment, my lease, my life, my home. But these complete strangers were living in it like they owned the place. The woman spoke broken English, asking if I needed help with something. I managed to stammer that this was my apartment, that I lived here. She looked genuinely confused and mentioned booking this place through some app for their vacation. The man pulled out his smartphone and showed me a confirmation screen that made my blood freeze. The booking clearly displayed my address, apartment 4B, with professional photos of my living room and bedroom. But instead of my name as the host, it showed David Chang Properties, with 5-star ratings and dozens of glowing reviews. The reservation dates started exactly 3 weeks ago, the day I'd been rushed to the hospital unconscious. My hands started shaking as the horrible realization hit me. My landlord had somehow rented out my apartment to tourists while I was fighting for my life in intensive care. I fumbled for my phone and dialed David Chang immediately. His voice was cheerful and businesslike when he answered, but the tone shifted to ice cold the moment I identified myself. There was a long, uncomfortable pause before he said he'd been trying to reach me for weeks about unpaid rent. I explained about the motorcycle accident, about being unconscious and unable to pay bills or answer calls. David said he had no record of any hospital stay and claimed I'd abandoned the apartment without proper notice. According to him, I'd violated my lease by disappearing without communication for weeks. He'd tried every method to contact me before deciding I'd simply moved out without telling him. Since the rent was overdue and the apartment appeared completely abandoned, he'd made the business decision to re-rent it to recover his financial losses. The tourists had a valid booking contract, had paid their full deposit, and he wasn't going to kick them out just because I'd suddenly reappeared with some convenient story about being hospitalized. I tried desperately to explain about the accident, the surgery, the weeks of recovery. David cut me off sharply, saying he needed official documentation before he'd even consider believing my story. Hospital records, insurance claims, something concrete and verifiable. Until then, these tourists had every legal right to occupy the apartment they'd legitimately rented. He hung up before I could respond, leaving me standing in the hallway outside my own home, feeling like I'd fallen into some alternate reality. The German tourists looked increasingly uncomfortable with the escalating situation. The woman kept glancing nervously between me and her husband, probably sensing this wasn't just some simple booking mix-up. I showed them my driver's license with this address, my apartment key that wouldn't work, photos on my phone of me living in this exact space. They seemed genuinely sympathetic, but explained they'd invested significant money in their vacation rental and didn't know what to do about this bizarre confusion. The woman handed me a business card for the booking platform they'd used, suggesting I contact customer service about the apparent double booking situation. Their kindness in the middle of this nightmare was almost more devastating than David's coldness. At least someone believed I wasn't completely insane. I called my friend Rachel, the only person who might understand this impossible situation without questioning my sanity. She answered on the second ring, and I tried to explain what was happening without sounding like I'd suffered brain damage in the accident. Rachel had visited my apartment countless times over the past 2 years. She knew I lived here, knew about the motorcycle crash, knew I'd been hospitalized. She said she'd drive over immediately to help figure this out. While waiting, I took the elevator down to the building's management office. The property manager, a stern woman named Vivian Torres, looked up from her computer with the weary expression of someone who dealt with tenant complaints all day. I explained the situation as calmly as possible, trying not to sound hysterical. My landlord had rented out my apartment while I was hospitalized. Complete strangers were living in my home. My key no longer functioned. Could she please help me sort out this administrative nightmare? Vivian pulled up my file on her computer system and frowned at whatever she was reading. According to her official records, my lease had been properly terminated 3 weeks ago due to abandonment and non-payment. David Chang had filed all the required paperwork with the management company. He'd documented multiple attempts to contact me, provided photographs showing the apartment appeared completely empty, and had followed proper legal procedures for dealing with abandoned rental property. From the building's perspective, Everything had been handled correctly according to standard protocols. I asked to see the documentation David had provided. Vivian hesitated, citing privacy concerns, but eventually turned her monitor toward me. The screen showed photographs dated 3 weeks ago of my apartment looking completely vacant. No furniture, no personal belongings, no indication that anyone had ever lived there. But that was impossible. I'd left everything exactly as it was when the ambulance rushed me to the emergency room. Rachel arrived looking shocked and furious about what I'd described over the phone. She'd been to my apartment dozens of times and could absolutely confirm I lived there. She'd even helped me move in 2 years ago, had keys to water my plants when I traveled. Vivian listened politely, but explained that the building management had to follow established legal procedures. David Chang held the master lease, and if he claimed the tenant had abandoned the property with proper documentation, the management company was obligated to accept his determination. We needed to resolve this dispute with him directly, not through building management. Back upstairs, the German couple was packing their belongings and preparing to leave early. They felt too uncomfortable staying in what might be someone's stolen home. The husband pressed $500 cash into my hand, apologizing for the situation and hoping I could sort everything out. Their unexpected generosity in the middle of this nightmare almost brought me to tears. Rachel helped me examine my apartment more carefully, and every detail made the situation more disturbing. Everything was subtly wrong. My furniture was there, but it had been completely rearranged. My personal photographs had been removed from the walls and replaced with generic tourist-friendly artwork. My clothes were gone from the bedroom closet, replaced with fresh linens and hotel-style towels. The refrigerator, usually stocked with my food and leftovers, contained only tourist basics like bottled water and sandwich supplies. Someone had systematically erased all evidence of my personal life from this space while maintaining the illusion that it was still my apartment. I found a stack of official-looking papers on my kitchen counter that made my blood run cold. Lease termination notice dated 3 weeks ago. Property abandonment documentation with those impossible photographs of my supposedly empty apartment. A new short-term rental agreement with the German tourists. And at the bottom, a bill for something called property clean-out and staging services in the amount of $3,000. Someone had professionally removed all traces of my existence from my own home and then charged me for the privilege. Rachel noticed something else deeply unsettling. The locks had been changed, obviously, but there were also new security cameras installed in the hallway that hadn't been there before my accident. When she checked the building's resident handbook, tenants weren't allowed to install surveillance equipment without written permission from management. But the timestamp on the camera system showed they'd been installed the day after I was hospitalized. Someone had been planning this systematic takeover from the moment the ambulance carried me away unconscious. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The message contained photographs of what looked like my personal belongings, all my clothes and furniture and electronics, sitting in some kind of storage facility. The text explained that if I wanted my stuff back, I needed to pay the storage fees that had been accumulating for 3 weeks. But here was the thing that made no sense. My furniture was currently sitting right here in my apartment, so how could the same items simultaneously be locked away in storage? I called the number immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed. A man answered, identifying himself as the owner of Chang Storage Solutions. He claimed to have a storage unit full of someone's belongings that had been dropped off 3 weeks ago, with instructions to hold everything until the owner could retrieve it. The person who'd rented the unit had paid the first month, but nothing since then. If I didn't come collect my possessions and pay the accumulated back fees within 24 hours, he'd dispose of everything according to state abandonment laws. The address for Chang Storage was across town in an industrial area. Rachel drove me there immediately, both of us trying to make sense of what was happening to my life. Inside the storage unit, I found the missing pieces of my existence. Not my furniture, but everything else that had made my apartment feel like home. My clothes, my photographs, my books, my electronics, my personal documents, everything that represented my identity and history. The furniture currently in my apartment was different pieces, carefully chosen to look similar, but not actually mine. Chang Storage Solutions was owned by David Chang, the same David Chang who was my landlord. He'd systematically removed all my personal belongings, replaced my furniture with rental pieces, professionally staged my apartment for tourists, and then held my actual possessions hostage while charging me storage fees for the privilege. This wasn't just opportunistic exploitation of my hospitalization. This was a calculated criminal scheme that required advanced planning, coordination, and infrastructure. Rachel took photographs of everything while I searched through boxes of my personal documents. I found my original lease agreement, my renter's insurance policy, and my bank statements showing automatic rent payments that had continued processing throughout my entire hospital stay. My rent wasn't actually overdue. The automatic electronic transfers had gone through exactly on schedule. David had fabricated the entire non-payment story to justify his actions. He'd lied about everything to create a legal pretext for stealing my apartment. My laptop was among the stored items, and when I powered it up, I discovered something that changed everything I thought I understood about this situation. David had been remotely accessing my email account for weeks. The login history showed dozens of sessions from his IP address throughout my hospitalization. He'd been reading my private communications, monitoring my medical status, and probably knew exactly when I'd be released from the hospital. He'd timed the tourist bookings to end precisely before my anticipated return, hoping I'd never discover what he'd done. But that was just the beginning of his digital invasion. I found emails he'd sent from my account to various people, making it appear I was planning to permanently relocate. Messages to my employer explaining I was quitting due to personal reasons and wouldn't be returning to work. Messages to my insurance company requesting policy changes and address updates. Messages to the hospital billing department providing a different forwarding address for my medical bills. He'd been systematically impersonating me electronically while I was unconscious, dismantling my entire life from the inside through identity theft. The most damning evidence was in my email sent folder, where David had used my account to list my own apartment as a short-term rental on multiple booking platforms. He'd created fake reviews using other email addresses he controlled, building up an impressive reputation as a reliable host using my actual home. The entire operation was designed to generate maximum rental income while keeping me completely unaware of what was happening to my own living space. He'd been running this scheme for months before my accident, using my apartment for weekend tourists whenever I traveled for work or visited family. The motorcycle crash had just provided him with the perfect opportunity to expand the operation to full-time tourist rentals. Rachel and I spent the next several hours methodically documenting everything we'd discovered. Photographs of my belongings imprisoned in storage, screenshots of the fraudulent emails sent from my account, records of the illegal access to my private communications, bank statements proving my rent payments had never been missed. We had enough evidence to demonstrate David had committed multiple serious crimes: identity theft, wire fraud, illegal eviction, computer hacking, and probably several others I couldn't even identify. But when we tried to file a police report, the situation became more complicated than I'd expected. The officer who responded seemed skeptical of our story, treating it like a typical landlord-tenant dispute rather than a criminal matter. From his perspective, David Chang had documentation showing he'd followed proper abandonment procedures. The fact that I'd been hospitalized didn't automatically invalidate those procedures under current housing law. He suggested we pursue this through civil courts rather than expecting criminal prosecution. But it was late Friday afternoon, and most law offices were closed for the weekend. Meanwhile, I had nowhere to live. My apartment was legally rented to new tourists who would be arriving Sunday morning. My belongings were locked in a storage facility I couldn't afford to maintain. My employer thought I'd voluntarily quit my job. My insurance was confused about my residential status. David had created a perfect storm of bureaucratic chaos designed to prevent me from ever successfully reclaiming my life. Rachel offered to let me stay at her place while we figured out next steps, but I could see the strain this crisis was putting on her own life. She had work responsibilities and her own apartment lease to worry about. I couldn't indefinitely impose on her friendship, no matter how generous she was willing to be. I needed to find a solution quickly, before David's scheme completely destroyed my ability to rebuild any semblance of normal life. Saturday morning brought a breakthrough that changed everything. While researching David Chang online, trying to find some weakness in his operation, I discovered he owned dozens of rental properties throughout the city. But more importantly, I found complaint forums where other tenants were describing eerily similar experiences. One detailed post was from a woman whose apartment had been rented to tourists while she was caring for her dying mother in another state. Another was from a military reservist who'd returned from overseas deployment to find his home occupied by strangers. A third was from an elderly man who'd been in rehabilitation after hip surgery. In every single case, David had used the identical playbook: claim abandonment, remove personal belongings to storage, stage the apartment for tourists, and present documentation that made everything appear legal and proper. This wasn't an opportunistic crime targeting my specific vulnerability. This was his established business model, a systematic operation for converting long-term rental units into higher-profit tourist accommodations by deliberately targeting tenants who were temporarily unable to defend themselves. The complaint forum had dozens of similar stories going back over 3 years. David had been perfecting this scheme for a long time. I found contact information for several of his previous victims and started making phone calls. The stories I heard were heartbreaking and infuriating. An Iraq war veteran who'd been hospitalized for PTSD treatment, only to return and find his apartment converted to an Airbnb. A single mother who'd been in rehab for addiction, whose children's belongings had been sold off as abandoned property while she was getting clean. A graduate student who'd been doing research abroad for her dissertation, who'd returned to find her apartment rented and all her academic work thrown away. Every victim had the same experience: disbelief, then desperate attempts to reclaim their homes, then grinding legal battles they couldn't afford, then eventual defeat and displacement. David had refined his methods through repetition, learning to exploit every weakness in tenant protection laws. But I also found something David hadn't expected: a tenants' rights organization that operated a weekend emergency hotline for housing crises. The volunteer I spoke with was immediately interested in my case, saying they'd been tracking patterns of predatory landlord behavior, but had never seen anything this systematically criminal. She connected me with Maria Gonzalez, an attorney who specialized in prosecuting landlord fraud and had been looking for a case strong enough to establish important legal precedents. Maria agreed to meet with me Sunday morning, explaining that she'd handled similar schemes before, but never one executed with such sophisticated planning and coordination. She warned me that stopping David would require moving extremely fast before he could destroy evidence or transfer assets. The key was proving this wasn't just a single incident, but a pattern of criminal behavior targeting multiple vulnerable tenants. Her office was cramped but organized, filled with case files that looked depressingly similar to my situation. She examined all our evidence with growing excitement, explaining that the email hacking constituted federal wire fraud. The systematic identity theft was prosecutable under multiple statutes. The coordinated nature of the scheme, combined with the other victim testimonies, could support charges for racketeering and organized criminal enterprise. But we needed to act immediately. David was probably already preparing to cover his tracks now that I'd discovered his operation and started asking questions. Maria made several phone calls while I sat in her office, speaking in legal terminology I didn't fully understand, but that sounded urgent and serious. Within an hour, she'd contacted federal investigators who specialized in financial crimes. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit was initially skeptical, but Maria's reputation and the strength of our evidence package convinced them to open an investigation immediately. She transmitted all our documentation electronically, along with contact information for the other victims I'd identified. Within hours, federal agents were preparing search warrant applications for David's properties, business records, and electronic accounts. The scope of his criminal operation was apparently much larger than any of us had initially realized. My case had provided investigators with the missing organizational details they needed to understand how David's entire network functioned. Sunday afternoon, FBI agents executed simultaneous raids on David's main office, his personal residence, several of his rental properties, and the storage facility where my belongings were being held hostage. They found detailed operational manuals for his abandonment recovery scheme, including step-by-step procedures for identifying vulnerable tenants, removing their belongings, and converting their homes to tourist rentals. He'd been running this criminal enterprise for over 4 years, generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in fraudulent income by systematically displacing residents who were temporarily unable to protect themselves. The federal agents also discovered David had been working with an entire network of criminal accomplices, a moving company that specialized in rapid property cleanouts with no questions asked, a furniture rental business that provided staging for tourist apartments, a property management firm that handled online bookings and guest services. Even Chang Storage Solutions was specifically designed as part of the scheme, created to hold victims' belongings hostage while generating additional revenue through accumulating storage fees. Maria called me Monday morning with news that felt completely surreal after weeks of feeling powerless. Federal prosecutors were filing serious charges against David and his entire criminal network. I would get my apartment back immediately, with all costs associated with the scheme charged to David as criminal restitution. More importantly, they'd identified 63 other victims whose apartments had been illegally converted to tourist rentals using the same systematic methods. The case was being fast-tracked due to the severity and scope of the crimes, but also because of the media attention it was generating. Local news outlets picked up the story of tourists unknowingly renting stolen apartments from hospitalized victims. The coverage sparked public outrage about how the short-term rental economy was being manipulated by criminals who preyed on society's most vulnerable members. But despite the legal vindication, the personal impact felt much more complicated than simple justice. How many other people were currently displaced from their homes, completely unaware that their landlords had commodified their lives while they were unable to resist? How many elderly people in nursing homes, deployed soldiers, hospitalized patients, or traveling workers had returned to find their entire existence had been erased for tourist convenience? The German tourists I'd encountered had been absolutely right to feel uncomfortable about the situation. They'd unknowingly participated in a criminal enterprise that destroyed people's lives for the convenience of vacation rentals. But they were also victims of David's deception, having paid good money for accommodations they believed were legitimate. The entire short-term rental economy had created perverse incentives that made this kind of exploitation not just possible, but profitable. Property owners could generate significantly more income from tourists than from stable long-term tenants, so vulnerable residents became expendable obstacles to profit maximization. The digital platforms that facilitated these bookings had created systems that prioritized transaction volume over verification, making it easy for criminals like David to operate with minimal oversight or accountability. David was arrested Monday evening while attempting to board a flight to a non-extradition country, his passport stuffed with cash and fake identification documents. His criminal operation had generated over $2.8 million in fraudulent income over 4 years, but the true cost was measured in dozens of destroyed lives, people who'd lost their homes, their belongings, their financial stability, and their trust in the systems that were supposed to protect them. The financial crimes were just the visible surface of much deeper human damage. I moved back into my apartment Tuesday afternoon, but the space felt fundamentally changed by what had happened there. Every corner reminded me of how easily my entire life had been erased while I was fighting for survival in a hospital bed. The sense of security I'd once felt in having my own home had been revealed as an illusion that could be shattered by anyone with sufficient criminal creativity and legal sophistication. My belongings came back from storage in boxes that mixed my most intimate possessions with items that weren't even mine. Photographs of my family were stacked together with someone else's books. My clothing was folded with blankets that smelled like strangers. The process of reclaiming my possessions felt like archaeology, carefully excavating the remains of my former life to reconstruct some semblance of normalcy. But normalcy seemed impossible when I understood how vulnerable I'd actually been all along. The legal proceedings moved faster than anyone had expected, largely because David's criminal accomplices started cooperating with federal prosecutors the moment they realized the scope of charges they were facing. The evidence was overwhelming, and the intense media attention made this case a priority for demonstrating that white-collar crime had serious consequences. Within 8 months, David was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, while his accomplices received sentences ranging from 2 to 8 years, depending on their level of involvement. The criminal enterprise was completely dismantled, but the broader questions it raised about housing security remained largely unaddressed. How many other landlords were running similar schemes in cities across the country? Justice in the courtroom couldn't repair the psychological damage to David's victims. Support groups formed among the people who'd been targeted by his scheme. We shared practical strategies for rebuilding credit ratings, for navigating the bureaucratic maze of correcting official records, for managing the anxiety that came from learning how easily our lives could be completely dismantled by criminal strangers. The trauma wasn't just about losing our apartments temporarily. It was about discovering how fragile our sense of security and belonging had always been. The settlement money helped cover the practical costs of recovery, but it couldn't address the deeper existential questions his crimes had forced us to confront. How many people were currently displaced from their homes, completely unaware that their absence was being systematically exploited? I testified before City Council about the urgent need for stronger tenant protections, particularly for people who were temporarily unable to advocate for themselves due to medical emergencies, military deployment, family crises, or other unavoidable circumstances. The tourism industry's appetite for authentic local experiences had created a gold rush mentality that treated housing as a commodity and vulnerable residents as acceptable casualties. We needed comprehensive legal reforms that recognized housing as a fundamental human right, not just another profit center for digital platforms and predatory landlords. But changing laws was a slow process. While criminals like David could destroy lives in a matter of weeks, the system was structurally biased toward protecting property rights over human rights, making exploitation almost inevitable under current legal frameworks. 18 months after recovering my apartment, the space finally felt like home again. I'd replaced all the furniture David had swapped out, painted over the generic staging colors, and filled the rooms with new memories that belonged exclusively to me. But every time I traveled for work or visited family, I found myself checking obsessively that my apartment was still mine when I returned. The fear of coming home to find strangers casually occupying my living room never completely disappeared. I'd developed elaborate security protocols, photographing my apartment before leaving, updating my lease documentation religiously, maintaining detailed records of every day I spent at home. I'd learned that in a world where housing was just another asset to be optimized by algorithms, permanent residency required constant vigilance to defend. David Chang died in federal prison during his 3rd year of incarceration, but his criminal legacy continued expanding through copycat schemes that emerged once his operational methods became public through court records. The problem had metastasized beyond any individual criminal. It had become a systematic feature of how housing markets operated in the digital economy, where profit optimization took precedence over human stability and community belonging. The final irony was that I'd become a tourist in my own neighborhood, constantly documenting my presence to prove I belonged there, always aware that my home could be stolen again by anyone creative enough to exploit the legal gaps that still protected property owners over vulnerable tenants.